biographies. There's a series. There's one on radio that's not very good. There's one on military technologies that's very good. There's one on the automobile. There's one on computers. And the notion was that technologies have a lifespan from conception to birth to school to work to children to death. At least that's the way I said, well, with television, that makes a great deal of sense because as a discrete system, it's disappearing, right? And so we can go to the beginning and work our way forward. So I will say this is a 50 to 60-minute presentation, but I hope you'll find it reasonably visually and intellectually engaging to go through. We're going to cover the life story of television. So let's start at the beginning. All right, quick, name this man. I know people have said you're all extremely well read and you've all got R.W. Burns's History of Television to about 1940, the International History of Television, which is where I got a lot of these early illustrations. There is a credit page at the end of this. This is Willoughby Smith, and he's one of the gentlemen in 1873 who discovered a photoelectric effect for selenium, the element, while working on underwater cables. And this was the stimulus, the publication of this notice was the stimulus in the 1870s for a lot of other people saying, wait, you mean we can take electricity and turn it into light, or vice versa? We could have images transmitted electrically. And this is the early contribution by the American. Most of the people working on this in the 19th century were European, and one of the themes of this book is that you watch over 100 years how the innovators in television, the leading researchers, move from Europe to the United States and on to Asia by the 1970s, 1980s in large part. So this is George Carey, a man out of Boston we know very little about, but he was one of the people that said, well, look, if we had enough of these selenium photocells, these pixels, we then have to figure out a way to scan. How do we convert a spatial image into a temporal image that's going to be transmitted one dot at a time? And that was the early problem, was the scanning. It's like, well, the only way we can do this is to have an electrical connection from each element to each element in the display. And then there were the various Europeans, Konstantin Senlek's telectroscope over here on the left, which is again sort of working in 1881, a year after Carey's publication, Scientific American. And then this is Shelford Bidwell, who was an early earnest Englishman who was trying to do this. And this is kind of a facsimile image. This is the actual image focus on the transmitter, just this simple diamond. And here was the scanned output that he got as a still illustration. But there was an inherent problem with selenium, which was the very long decay. And here you should pay attention that the y-axis, it's inverted. It goes from low resistance down to high resistance. So it starts at 0 at 60,000 ohms and rises to 25,000 ohms. So you should almost, I don't know why the Germans did this. This is a 1920s, I think, illustration. But there's a fairly quick rise time, decline in resistance, and then a long decay in the other direction. So you have this retention of image. Once you get something on a selenium photocell, it takes a while to disappear, and that was an inherent problem. Now, the other issue we know about, I think I probably showed this in the past, the famous illustration from 1879 in the English magazine Punch about, well, what would people do with, what will Mr. Edison do next? And they were taking the notions of the telephone, sound recording, you know, the telegraphy, electric light, and then these rumors of this electric vision, and you would have things where people would be able to talk on the video phone around the world to your relatives in New Zealand. And the French, this fellow Robida, you know, this is the French thinking about it. Well, what we really want to do is men smoking cigars in the privacy of their room watching dancing girls. Or when you get to the interactive phone, it hasn't changed. She's breaking up with him. I want to be friends, and he's about to throw the chair through the flat panel display. So you can imagine this is one of the reasons video phones have never quite taken off until most recently. And then this is why we have graduate students, this problem of trying to solve how do we do the technology of scanning in some relatively simple way without massive numbers of contacts. And this is our man, whose name I'm now blanking on, Paul Nipkow, who on Christmas Eve 1884, working in an attic in Berlin, came up with this notion of the spinning disc with the spiral holes pierced, filed for a patent in early 1885, and then proceeded not to make a penny from it. But this was the notion in 1884 of an electromechanical system as opposed to a purely electrical system. And over the next 20 to 30 years, there were dozens of people who came up with these ideas. This notion that there's one brilliant inventor that comes up with this idea that God is touched or is somehow special, it's simply not true. Everyone is working from a common literature, whether it's technical or scientific. They're all working on a similar problem based on the available technologies, and there's all sorts of ideas coming up. Some of them are here. This is a fellow named, I think, Gustav Dieckmann, or Thomas Dieckmann, T-H-D, using a Brown tube, the oscilloscope, which had been commercialized in between 1897 and 1900. By 1906, this is June 8th, 1906, you're seeing Brown, TD. It's using a script, but it's also using these pairs of magnets, north and south and left and right, to do a beer stein here. So it's sex, beer are the things that we're watching on television. And here is Boris Rosing, who a year later in St. Petersburg, was saying, well, let's take the cathode ray tube and then let's see if we can use a series of mirrors instead of perforated discs to capture an image on a photocell. And that's where Vladimir Zworykin was getting some of his early inspiration. And a year later, Alan Archibald Campbell Swinton, although his surname was Swinton, made a presentation before the Society for Röntgenology or Röntgenovs, the people working on X-rays, that was published in a small piece in the London Times the next day about, well, we could use these same cathode ray tubes and reverse the process with them done properly. And this was a proposal that he embroidered in a sort of erratic series of articles right up to 1920 when he said, but this would take a large industrial research lab because he could see how difficult it was. He was probably anticipating the issue of how do you store light from each pixel as your scanning beam is going past all the others. So let's move on. That was the conception. We had about 40 years, 1873 to 1923, of people thinking of ideas of how to send video images either electrically or electromechanically. And we get to 1923, 1924. Vladimir Zworykin, who has read some of Swinton's work, had worked with Rosing, had been thinking about this. He's proposing an iconoscope and filing an early patent, which can never be actually reduced to practice. It's not until 1925 that he comes up with the second patent that allows him to demonstrate this project at Westinghouse. In the meantime, there is this exceedingly eccentric and very bright British inventor, John Baird, who, just look at this setup, and I think this is a somewhat later picture. The crudity with which he's working, the amount of investment that anyone's willing to gamble on him, it's still astonishing that the BBC was drawn into this because it was still the only game in town. And as quickly as early 1924, a local newspaper cartoonist is already drawing a cartoon based on what they've heard about Baird's technology to say, we're going to be able to watch sports and the refs will be able to stay home and make their calls on the football or soccer game. And then there was Charles Jenkins. I apologize for not having some of the earlier photos. I was loading this up before I left New Jersey 2 or 3 days ago and somehow missed all the ones I just scanned. This is his 1929 Jenkins televisor with the silhouette images. I think that maybe it's his wife and daughter are watching here. And this was all you could get out of his scanning device, were these little silhouette cartoons that he got about 30 people across the eastern United States who bought these as novelties. In the meantime, this was a technology that, wow, anybody who's a radio enthusiast, it's not that difficult to make your own. Hugo Gernsback is pumping this up in his magazines. And then there are various people who sense a way to make a buck out of this. Ulysses Sanabria, Jenkins is trying to go into business. Baird has got the BBC beginning to do this. So there's a boomlet in electromechanical, NIPCOW, mostly NIPCOW-based television systems in the late 1920s where they're claiming they have 10,000 people with these. It's time for the Federal Radio Commission to approve a federal television standard based on this technology. And at the same time, there are people like David Sarnoff who are, paying attention to this at a remove and looking forward to various forms of transmission. And Vladimir Zworykin in December 29 is showing off his Westinghouse CRT receiver along with the pictures. This is one of the early 1923-25 iconoscopes. And then you had the people working on the dissectors. Here is this fellow Diekmann again in 1925 in Germany. He came up with the idea for an image dissector. Never could reduce it to practice, but you don't notice him pursuing this after Farnsworth has accomplished this in 1927-28. This is the brilliant schoolboy idea without storage, and he basically spends the rest of his life pursuing a technological dead end. That has a number of very vital components like sawtooth scanning and low-velocity scanning that RCA ultimately needs to license from him. And this is an example of the quality of imagery 2 to 3 years after he's begun working on this. This is his wife, Pem Farnsworth. You can see that this is either outdoors or under extremely bright arc lamp. Her eyes are closed. And that's the kind of resolution you get when you don't have storage in your video camera. In the meantime, what can you do if you are a large industrial research laboratory and you're AT&T, you have boodles of money, you are a federally regulated monopoly, and you are dedicated to universal service, and then increasing the options with television would be to say, well, what if we can add television to your telephone? So the whole idea under Mr. Ives at AT&T in Murray Hill, Manhattan, was to say, let's do a video phone for the universal telephone service. And they made the best NIPCOW discs. They got the best, world's largest photocells. There's 3 of them around this individual with a microphone. And then they said, well, instead of having 2 spinning discs, which each of these prototype setups had, there was a camera and a display using a NIPCOW disc at both sides. What if we could simply make a 2,500 pixel image using an S-curved neon tube with a series of electrodes, 2,500 electrodes mounted externally on this tube, and then on the back of it, I'm sorry I don't have the photo of it, but this, basically there's 2,500 wires going in and a spinning brush with the contacts on this. What's that? Yes, exactly, right.
Is that comma in the wrong place? Go back.
Oh, whoops, did I, yes, it's supposed to be 500,000, sorry. So, and then you had General Electric, where this fellow Ernst Alexanderson on the upper right with young Ray Kell. Here is the guy that did the Alexanderson alternator, this magnificent electromagnetic device for transoceanic transmission of radio. And he was simply applying all of his knowledge as an electromechanical engineer to saying, look, we can do television cheaply, efficiently now. It leads to the first theater broadcast on the air out of Schenectady, the Queen's Messenger. You can see the actor here looking very dubiously at the photocells, which is not a terribly pleasant experience for someone used to a live audience. And then here is Alexanderson with my version of what you got as an output was this basically 2 square inches of Felix the Cat at 60 lines. So it's a 60 DPI almost image. And he's used adapted RCA GE radios and loudspeakers here. And meanwhile, you had Zworykin at Westinghouse. On the left is, as far as we know, this was the first prototype from the summer of 1929. He gave a talk in the fall of 1929 to the Institute of Radio Engineers in I think, Albany, New York, or Rochester, New York, where he never actually showed. But this is where he was announcing, we have a picture tube now which is bright enough to be seen in daylight. The early picture tubes, you lost a lot of electrons. They diffused. They left the glass envelope. He began to coat it with an aquadag, I think, to reflect them back on. And here you can actually see the W for Westinghouse on his adapted television in 2930. At that point, Sarnoff has finally convinced Westinghouse and GE to assign to RCA all of their technical staffs in radio and electronics and let them continue to do power and trains and turbines and so forth. And Sarnoff has also gotten permission to go and buy the Victor Talking Machine Company to begin to make their own radios and electronic products. RCA was losing money on radios every year, actually up until at least 1937, in part during the 1920s because there was the middleman of their suppliers, and then in the 1930s during the Depression. And here is Vladimir Zworykin's first notebook. Those of you who were 2 years ago, you've seen some of these before, but this is dated April 3rd, 1930, V. Zworykin, file number 1. It's actually notebook number 545 or 245 there. And here is page 1, new design of a cathode ray transmitting tube, that is a camera tube, with a something anode and electron accumulating, V. Zworykin, April 28th, 1930. And this is basically after he came back from visiting Farnsworth's lab where this legendary encounter took place, and people claim that, well, Zworykin's first patent after that had to do with taking ideas from the image dissector. And what it actually seemed to do was confirm him in knowing that storage was the key issue here, and Farnsworth didn't have it. And the problem was, great, we've said we need to store light on these individually sensed capacitive or pixels, these photoelectric pixels. How the heck do you actually do that in real life? And Rob Florey, who is the grandson of Zworykin's, one of his lead assistant engineers, Les Florey, has these things where they had individual rivets, basically, all bonded together and matrixed in the back. And they were trying to do ruling and scrolling of the sensitive cesiated plate. And here's the hood where they're trying to do the evacuation on these early iconoscopes. And it's really this fellow named Sanford Essig, the glassblower, who has this patent disclosure. Here's his signature with Harley Iams, who is another guy working on the iconoscope in Zworykin's group. Curiously, it's either 1/12 or December 1st, 1931. Iams has signed, witnessed it either before or after he thought about this, depending on whether Essig's a real German-American. But it was the whole notion of, geez, we left this in the oven too long, but Essig had the foresight or the knowledge to know serendipitously that an accident is what we are trying to accomplish. And that's half the point of doing raw scientific research is you know what you're looking for, you simply don't know necessarily how you're going to get it. I mean, nobody's done this before. And this was the notion of baking the mosaic and isolating each of those pixels. And this is the outcome. Here is Vladimir Zworykin in his nice wool suit with his waistcoat. And here is the photo of him, and you can just flash back to that picture of Pem Farnsworth. This is the iconoscope in 1933. And now we move on to school. All right, we've given birth to Nipkow disc television, to electronic television, and now we've got to sort of train it to get it ready for prime time, rather figuratively and literally. And all during the 1930s, it's like, how are we going to move this forward? And part of it was doing tests. I believe this is the University of Pennsylvania at Franklin Field. It would be the college closest to RCA that you wouldn't necessarily have to pay royalties to if you were going to do experimental television broadcasts. And then you were improving the quality of the mirror screen and the display here, the picture tube with the silvered sides. And then some issues with, well, these picture tubes, we're not making very many of them, we're losing quite a few. How could we amplify this picture? And this is Russell R. Law, who was one of the early people involved with, raising the voltage that you could send through a cathode ray tube. In 1936, he gave a demonstration showing this quite amplified photo or television image for theaters. And this began to become an issue with, well, what's the commercial point of television? Who's going to pay for the production of content? And the awareness from the very start, I mean, Sarnoff is trying to convince the motion picture industry in 1931 that television is not its enemy but its friend. The television industry is going to need old movies to fill all those hours of broadcasting because the live production is going to be so expensive. Meanwhile, here is Farnsworth outside on what is now, I guess, the J.F. Kennedy Boulevard or whatever, between the Franklin Institute and Center City in August 1934. And you will notice that he's using tackling dummies, a lamp here, and then a carbon arc or a Klieg light here. In the middle of the summer, it's a cloudy or overcast day, but he's still got to get immense amounts of light to get any sort of picture out of his image dissector camera. In the meantime, RCA is going through its 5 field tests to find out about reception, co-channel interference, adjacent channel interference. And they've done their 1936 test. They've lined this up with 363-line television. They're leapfrogging ahead of what you can do with NIPCOW desks. And here in the upper left is David Sarnoff, and on the left, General Harber, the chairman of RCA's board, with the 3 Soviet representatives who are about to buy or have just bought a complete RCA television system. I gave a talk about that several years ago. And then here are various members of RCA's power elite. O.B. Hansen, the chief engineer for NBC, the young Elmer Engstrom, who is the first person to say we need to approach television more systematically than what Zworykin is doing, and other people who are sort of working out all the different steps of a commercial systems innovation. In the meantime, we've already seen a number of other images of the amount of light that even an iconoscope needs, and if you're in a television studio today, you still know that they need an awful lot of light. And so Zworykin, along with Les Flory and George Morton, are trying to add electron multipliers. How do we amplify the signal, reduce the amount of light, and amplify the signal in secondary stages, and then move on to Albert Rose's the orthicon. And here is Sarnoff in 1939, after 10 years of investment, trying to convince the FCC and the American public we need to commercialize this 441-line standard now. It took another 2 years, by which RCA was already involved in the war effort. And here's an example of some of the content that you got. Great, we got President Roosevelt opening the World's Fair on April 30th, and then talent shows. Anybody who could show up with a ukulele could get on, RCA NBC camera #1 and publicize their shtick. And then you had the more portable cameras. I'm waiting for Chuck Farris to show one of these. And then you added these. You could stick them into an airplane and begin to use these for what Zworykin had said as early as 1934 would be for guided TV missiles. And then this is the projection theater. This is a baseball game at the New Yorker Theater in 1941. And now we move on to work. It was supposed to be commercial, but the war got in the way, and Albert Rose, Paul Weimer, and Harold Law are here standing over one of the first image orthicon tubes with the camera circuitry. This is the patent disclosure television pickup tube from Harold B. Law in 1942-43, basically explaining all the different multiplier and low velocity scanning steps that go into this. And here is Rose holding it, and Ray Kell, we may remember him from the Alexanderson days, having moved to the Princeton labs where all this was done, and being on the roof of the RCA labs under a full moon, which is bouncing off of his glasses. That was the sensitivity of the image orthicon. And some of you who like perusing ads from 1946-47 will see that series of RCA laboratories advertisements, one of which is the image orthicon, the camera with the eyes of a cat. It can see in the dark. And here is an example taken during the war of a GLOM, the glider bomb, which had either the small, I think the 1841 or 42 iconoscope, or the early image orthicon, and it would be TV guided. The ailerons would be guided by radio control from another plane or from this plane. RCA made, with another contractor, to about 4,000 of the various project-guided missiles, and the military, i.e. the Army Air Force and the U.S. Navy Air Forces, were not especially interested in trying to establish themselves as a bunch of, desk jockeys, quite literally, who are out of danger. If you're going to be a new branch of the armed services, you better be out there risking your own life. And so for various policy reasons, a lot of this work, which had a 50% success rate in the Pacific, was pushed well behind the front lines of the military offensive. And while it had the success rate, it was never actively, enthusiastically pursued. And this is a post-war example. This is a government photo, government 5505 from the laboratories. And I think this is the guided GLOM, which probably has the miniature image orthicon, the MIMO, which was much smaller and compact than that bigger one we saw earlier. So now we move on. After the war, here is Sarnoff at Atlantic City telling the NBC radio stations, go get your TV licenses. It's going to cost money, but you will certainly benefit from it. And here's your image orthicon television camera, which Sarnoff had to force NBC to adopt because they were really quite happy with the improved iconoscope cameras. And there's the manufacturing, the installation, your friendly RCA servicemen, which all of you know from your friendly Dell servicemen with your personal computers. And then you had whether you call it the skunk at the garden party, which would be Peter Goldmark and CBS saying, well, wait a minute, why do we have to go with this whole step of black and white? We can do color now. And this is Goldmark being a very clever, essentially electromechanical engineer who wasn't hired by RCA when he came from Hungary in 1936, and coming up with this rather clever, very low brightness, flickering technology, and saying we can do this. And RCA had to move fairly quickly. Here is Goldmark with one of his color wheels. And here is the demonstration with film. This is from a 1946 illustration with the selector disc and the color drum doing this output. And here are two of the sort of prototype or speculative versions, a projection color television and a 1946 CBS television. Meanwhile, so RCA had to say, all right, quickly, let's not go so fast, go back to moving parts and motors and all these power supplies. We can do electronic color television in 1946 at the Penn's Neck Recreation Center, which is still on Route 1 in Princeton, abandoned. And here is the example with the color transparency taped over the projection to give you an idea of what it's like. But this did lead to people in labs saying, well, how are we really going to do this? The real problem with color television electronically is registration. You have three primaries. How are you going to align those simultaneously with one set of electromagnets, much less get a motion picture? And Al Schroeder here was the guy that said, well, first we can demonstrate a common electromagnetic yoke. For 3 electron guns, we have 3 color filters on the front of the tube, a bunch of dichroic mirrors that can then project it. This is what Sarnoff was invited down to the labs to watch in, I think, early 1947, whereupon he said, we are never going back to mechanical television, which RCA had tested extensively to the extent of doing 3-dimensional TV with polarized glasses in 1945-46. CBS managed to get a number of sympathizers on the Federal Communications Commission, a number of very clever demos in surgical settings where you need an extreme amount of light. You don't have too many fast-moving things going on, and so color TV looks pretty good. It hasn't cost William Paley very much. He's not a technological innovator, but if he can throw a wrench in the works of transiting his radio stations to television, that's so much the better for him and his advertisers. So by 1949, the summer of 49, the FCC is going to begin to hold hearings, and RCA Laboratories begins to look more vigorously at this, both before and during the hearings in the fall of 49, which are a disaster for RCA's trinoscopes, the ones with 2 and 3 picture tubes that they're trying to align. This is Ed Harold, who becomes the head of the single tube color effort, Elmer Engstrom, Harold Law, and then they roll out Vladimir Zworykin, who really had nothing to do with the project, but he's the guy of RCA's television. And so here are the demos in 1950, the surreptitious color image of a 1-gun and 3-gun color television sets with a black and white set in the middle, showing that you can now do color in a box approximately the same size as your black and white. And here is a blow-up of one of the images they threw over an AT&T coaxial network cable to show that they could do full color within, I think, 2.8 megahertz. Now, over the next few years, the rest of the TV and broadcast industry realized the writing on the wall. RCA's system is going to be the future color standard. The Columbia system, for all the people here who say we could have had it this way, I ask you, why hasn't Burma or North Korea or South Korea or any of those Asian countries said, geez, we could do color television for a lot cheaper in 1970 with a color wheel than we could with a picture tube? I think the world's vote is fairly important in dismissing this. So here is the NTSC, one of the issues of the proceedings of the IRE, their flag with the colors and quad. In the meantime, you had all this black and white building up. There are 20 million sets by 1953 in American hands, and one of RCA's arguments for their system is that it was compatible. CBS's was not going to be compatible unless you had a set-top box, and we know what that means for you who are looking at HDTV. And to set one up in the United States with the number of people from the RCA service company, it was going to be 20 years before everyone got their black and white sets adapted to CBS color. But here is an example, and we've already seen in the auction, dozens of the 1950s television sets. In the meantime, out in Lancaster, RCA is trying to commercialize these 21-inch picture tubes. This is 1955 manufacturing capability for color shadow mass, testing the phosphor dispositions. You have red, green, and blue emitting phosphors, all of which have to be aligned with the shadow mass that blocks 2 of the 3 electron guns from them. And here's the glass metal fusing and tubing. And then you'll notice the Indian head test pattern over here on these picture tubes. And here is some of the issues in terms of why RCA in many ways was not expecting to really push color television until the late 50s. I mean, Sarnoff is no fool. He understands you have one innovation. The public is not going to rush out and replace it. And CBS would have faced this same problem if they had even had the money to invest in as much manufacturing as RCA did. So you can look at the production in thousands of black and white sets from 1946. Granted, you had that pre-war 39 to 40 production, but here's your 5,000 color sets, and you're already dropping behind by 1956. Those of you who are collecting color TVs, look at this number for 1957. It's 56, the heck with that. It's these and 1958. This is the valuable year for late 1950s color TVs. I think by 58, RCA was the only company manufacturing color televisions, and then they had signed the consent decree with the U.S. Department of Justice. It gave up all their broadcast-related patents, about 3,000 for both radio and television, black and white and color, to all their domestic licensees. Now had free access to RCA's intellectual property. And that began to open up, along with NBC's steady increase in color transmission, along with Disney's Wonderful World of Color. And so you're finally beginning to get up to your sales here in 1966. You're now outstripping in the same chronology. And in 20 years, from, say, 1947 to 1967, you have, 120,000 color sets down to 5 million color sets being produced a year in the late 60s. And so there's the 2 millionth color television made by RCA in '65. And here's all the tired daddies stopping to watch the World Series, I think in 1956 in Grand Central Station. So David Sarnoff is quite pleased by all this, and now we're going to move on to the offspring, the system's offspring of television. And the first one we want to go to, or the two of them that we want to go to, are video recording and a flat panel display. In 1951, Sarnoff was celebrating his 45th anniversary in electronics. Looking forward 5 years, RCA renamed the laboratory as the David Sarnoff Research Center, and he asked for 3 anniversary gifts. They're called the birthday presents, but they were for his 50th anniversary in electronics. And one of them was color videotape. You know, we have audio tape now, but we really need for television, the next step in television will be, can people record their own home audio, home video in color, because you've just done color television. And the other thing I would like, one of the other 2 things I would like, is can you make me a light amplifier by which we can project, at that point, pictures on a wall, video on a wall. And he was aware that these big boxes, his wife is no happier with this giant cabinet in the living room than anybody else, any other woman. And so if you could have a TV to hang on a wall, that would be a really good idea. This is a 1968 matrix that was never actually demonstrated for liquid crystal displays. And this is the Ampex crew that actually made the practical black and white videotape compared to RCA's Kluge color videotape. And this is an example of what they did without having to worry about color from 1955 up to 1956, the very rapid progress that they could make once they had sort of solved the nut problem in video recording. And ultimately, Ampex and RCA cross-licensed their patents for color and for video recording and fought it out in the marketplace. In the meantime, the Japanese were licensing from RCA and from Ampex, but there were a number of Japanese engineers who were very inspired by the early announcements of RCA and color videotaping. Meanwhile, Sarnoff was not terribly pleased with the light amplifier, you can see here, and that didn't work out very well. But it was inspiration or incentive to any researcher at the David Sarnoff Research Center who had an idea for flat panel television. There was a shop order that you could fill and experiment with